Hello, everybody. Welcome back. This is going to be the start of a mini series that I was inspired to do by my buddy Glenn Kellaway from the basement, who, if you don't know, recently went through a series where he discussed, how each year in the 60s and 70s in particular could be voted as one of the better years in music. And he messaged me probably about 2 weeks ago or so and said, "Hey, you should do something similar for Americana music. Do it by the decade." And so I wasn't sure if I was going to do it. I was kind of back and forth on it because my collection isn't necessarily extensive, but I did go through. These aren't necessarily the best records in Americana music from the 1960s. They are, however, a lot of these are very fundamentally important for what would become the Americana genre, which is still a fairly new term. And I know a lot of people that were doing my Americana tag were sure to point that out, that Americana didn't really show up until the 90s or so, to be widespread. But these aren't ranked. These are chronological by year. I don't know. I don't have exact dates for when they came out. So I've got a couple from 64, 69, whatever. They're all going to be grouped into the year. So this is going to kind of be a little bit of a just description of how this genre kind of started, and I'm going to do my best to articulate it with the limited knowledge that I have. So to understand Americana, you have to know that as a rule, Americana kind of takes on elements of country music, of folk music, of rock music. It takes on a lot of traditional bluegrass type instruments, acoustic instruments, but also is known to have some rockers. I mean, you have artists that came up in the '90s that a lot of people would consider Americana. Whether that's Sun Volt or Wilco, Uncle Tupelo, those early records in the '90s like that fall specifically in the Americana vein. And again, they draw on these influences. They draw on a lot of the records that I'm about to show. So, for the sake of this, these are not necessarily Americana albums, especially when they came out, because there was no such thing as Americana. But these are a lot of the basics of what Americana music would become. Somebody said one time that Americana music is just liberal country. And there is probably some truth to that, in the sense that a lot of Americana music doesn't really shy away from political lyrics or topics. Not saying that traditional country music doesn't do that as well, but you take a song like Loretta Lynn about divorce, or something like that. That's a statement right there. But Americana music specifically kind of takes stands for current events. So with that, we have to think about the folk scene. We have to think about what was happening in the 1960s in New York, in Washington Square Park, with artists like Peter, Paul and Mary, Dave Van Ronk, Ramblin' Jack Elliott, these people that were playing the coffee shops, that were singing about the Vietnam War, the civil rights movement, women's rights, everything that was happening in 1960s, especially the early part of the 60s, post Kennedy assassination, all that stuff. So that's kind of where I'm coming from with a lot of what I'm going to show. So the first one, again, let's talk about bluegrass. This is the Dillards' Back Porch Bluegrass. Now, again, bluegrass music, as it sounds, comes from old time music, which is the music that people were making up in the Appalachian Mountains, back in the 1800s. And bluegrass was kind of trying to take that feel and make it a little bit cleaner, a little bit more polished. And what was happening in the 60s, a lot of these folk groups had banjos, and you had, country music was really, all the rage. You had, shows like, Andy Griffith, where the Dillards played the Darling Brothers, the Darling Boys. and it was becoming part of the mainstream. You had the Beverly Hillbillies with Flatt and Scruggs playing the theme song. Uh, you would later, a little bit later on, you'd have Deliverance making this, big splash with, the song "Dueling Banjos," which is a traditional tune that the Dillards actually cover. But what was happening was that this old time kind of players were taking new songs that were, popular at the time. The Dillards were covering Bob Dylan. They were writing their own songs. They weren't just sticking to the traditional songs. They weren't just doing, "Frog You in a Courtin" and that kind of stuff. They were mixing the pop songs with gospel music, like "Somebody Touched Me." They were doing their original songs like "Dooley" and "The Old Home Place." Again, they do "Dueling Banjos" on here. You have them taking on kind of a new style of bluegrass that Earl Scruggs would definitely polish up and really kind of take by storm in the late 60s into the 70s. So Dillard's Back Porch Bluegrass. Um, I'll have a lot of CDs here. I didn't want to pull records. I just didn't feel like it. So the Freewheelin' Bob Dylan. Now again, this is folk music. I understand that this, I'm not saying that this is Americana, but this is, music that would shape what Americana music would become. This is Dylan's second album, his first real album as an artist. It's all Dylan original tunes. Obviously, you have songs like "Blowin' in the Wind," "Don't Think Twice, It's All Right," "Hard Rain's Gonna Fall." What else is on here? "Masters of War," "Girl from the North Country." Just so many great tunes. It kind of encapsulates what Dylan was doing at the time in Greenwich Village in New York. And even this photo right here was just taken about a block away from his apartment, which I just got to see this summer, which was really cool. But just Dylan with a guitar, again, something that was more associated with, country kind of stuff. Dylan was taking the acoustic guitar and writing songs that were powerful and were becoming anthems. Obviously, "Blowing in the Wind" became a huge song during the March on Washington and during the Civil Rights Movement. So the Freewheelin' Bob Dylan really kind of kicked off a lot of people into buying acoustic guitars and writing folk music. So that's an album that I have to mention as well. So again, with all that, there are all sorts of albums that you could and songs that you could pick. I mentioned "Peter, Paul, and Mary." There were several Dylan songs. Obviously folk rock became big. Buffalo Springfield, all that's the Byrds really started that in the mid '60s. The Hollies, to an extent, people like that. Some of the British invasion groups were kind of latching on as well. But then you get into the late '60s. So I'm intentionally skipping a few years here. You get into 1967, and you have this record that comes out. This is Johnny Cash live at Folsom Prison. This is probably Johnny's most well-known record, recorded live at Folsom. He's got Carl Perkins with him. He's got the Carter family. He's got the Statler brothers, and a top-notch band here. You have Johnny connecting with the prisoners. You have Johnny connecting with people that robbed, that were murderers, that did terrible, horrendous things. Folsom was a high-security prison, and Johnny Cash had the guts to go in there and record a record for these men who he said were still valuable people that still had, something to say. And a lot of them, ended up getting out and doing good things, including one, Mr. Merle Haggard, who was in the audience during this recording. And he kind of, associates this album with the thing that, really scared him straight. This was the album that kind of made him turn to a life of music. And he did it for the rest of his life. But fantastic songs on here. Again, you've got that rockabilly sound with the Cash outlaw attitude on here. Again, he's singing songs that have statements. He's singing songs like "Greystone Chapel," which was written by a prisoner in Folsom that had given Johnny the lyrics just while Johnny was visiting, and he recorded it right there on the spot. Was doing songs like "Cocaine Blues." He was doing songs like "Folsom Prison Blues." He was singing songs like "I Got Stripes," legend, traditional songs. He was doing songs that were saying something. He was always advocating for the downtrodden and this record rocks, and really is kind of taking country, putting it in the mainstream. So Johnny Cash live at Folsom from 1967. Jumping ahead to 1968, we got a few records here. This is when Americana is really kind of becoming what we know it to be. And you can't talk about Americana without talking about the band. This is their debut, music from Big Pink. Artwork there by Bob Dylan, who they were hanging out with up in Woodstock at the house there that they called Big Pink. Is a bunch of Canadian guys with Lee Von Helm from Arkansas writing music that sounded more American than a lot of the stuff that was coming out at the time. I mean, at this point, you were having stuff, like Odyssey and Oracle coming out. The hippie stuff. You had just shortly before this was released, you had stuff like Sgt. Pepper and Magical Mystery Tour coming out. You had stuff like Good Vibrations. Nothing like this was coming out. Dylan had gone electric. The world had kind of, cracked open, full on psychedelia. And then these guys show up. They don't even show up on the cover and play this music that's haunting, that is acoustic, that's dark, that's fun. It's all these different things. There's mixes of New Orleans in it with accordion music. There's soul with the vocals of Richard Manuel and Lee Von Helm. Some funk with the grooves of Rick Danko, and then some really just hot guitar licks by Robbie Robertson. It's just so good. You have songs on here like Tears of Rage. You have The Weight, their most well-known song, which has become a staple. Chest Fever, This Wheel's on Fire, I Shall Be Released. A lot of songs written and co-written by Bob Dylan with the guys, and just fantastic stuff. This is more American music than a lot of American artists were putting out, and it's put out by 4 Canadians and a guy from Arkansas. So the band, music from Big Pink, really kick-starting kind of what we know as like roots music and Americana music. Again, kind of jumping across the pond. Not that this is Americana music, because this is more in lines with like the English folk scene, but you were having stuff over in England like Fairport Convention, Richard Thompson with them, doing all these different types of music. John Martin was over there playing. And then you have Nick Drake, who puts out this album, Five Leaves Left. Again, pretty stripped back. It's pretty much Nick with guitar. There are some strings on here as well, but just haunting kind of folk music, acoustic music with these like soft, smoky vocals that come out of Nick. And I've talked about Nick a million times on my channel, but the influence was, it was showing up on both sides of the pond in the United States and in the UK. So I had to show Nick Drake there. Talked about the Byrds earlier, but I was saving them because the Byrds at this point, they are, a jingle jangle band. They put out songs like, Dylan's Mr. Tambourine Man and I'll Feel a Whole Lot Better, than psychedelic kind of stuff like 8 Miles High or, stuff like that. And then they go through a major lineup change. They lose David Crosby. Gene Clark had already been gone for a couple of years. Michael Clark, the drummer, was already booted. And then Roger McGuinn and Chris Hillman, as well as the other 2 members what was their name? Kevin Kinney or something, whatever his name was. Kevin Kelly on drums. And then you've got Graham Parsons, who would become a stalwart in the country rock kind of phase. The Byrds come out with this record right here, Sweetheart of the Rodeo from 1968. Again, called country rock at the time. It's really, looking back on it, a straight-ahead country record. There's not a whole lot of rock on here. It's rock and roll guys playing country music, but they've got one of the best album openers ever with You Ain't Going Nowhere. Beautiful song, Hickory Wind by Graham Parsons. They're also doing stuff like I Am a Pilgrim, The Christian Life, which is the old Louvin Brothers tune. Pretty Boy Floyd, the Woody Guthrie tune. Nothing Was Delivered, a Bob Dylan song. So you're getting these guys that are fully embracing country music, that are fully embracing roots music and folk music to another level. Again, they're realizing, oh, this is where music is going. You've had the Beatles putting out, more acoustic stuff. You know, you've got same year you've got the White Album that comes out by the Beatles. You have again, country influences from the Byrds on previous records, like Time Between, Mr. Spaceman. That's all stuff that is rooted in country music. And then they just let it all hang out kind of here on the Sweetheart of the Rodeo record, which has become a huge influence on a ton of modern artists today that, look to this album as kind of the beginning of their love of country music. And a lot of those people, became kind of mainstays in the Americana world. So Sweetheart of the Rodeo is a must. And then as part of kind of the breakup of the Byrds original lineup, they're kind of spawned out of that album this record right here, The Gilded Palace of Sin by the Flying Burrito Brothers. Here you have Chris Hillman, Graham Parsons, kind of putting together this new band of country rock kind of music. Sneaky Pete Kleino and Chris Etheridge to line it all out. You would have guys coming out of this band throughout the years. You would have Bernie Ledden of the Eagles make an appearance in the Burrito Brothers. Clarence White, is playing on the Byrds records and all that stuff. Just a lot of solid country rock tunes. I mean, listen to the song Christine's Tune, a great opener. Sin City is a fantastic tune. Hot Burrito number 2, I believe. But yeah, this is one of the better albums in my collection. This is an SACD, but yeah, kind of taking the Sweetheart of the Rodeo and perfecting it is what the Burritos did, especially on those first couple of Burrito records with this original lineup. So they are really important as well. And then I mentioned Bob. It's kind of hard to talk about Americana without mentioning Bob Dylan a couple different times. Now we're into 1969. The Gilded Palace of Sin was from 69. Jumping over to this album right here again, Dylan fully embracing his country roots on, I'll say country roots, his country music knowledge on Nashville Skyline from 1969. Major hit on here with Lay Lady Lay, but he also has a beautiful cover of Girl from the North Country, which is one of his tunes that he had on the Freewheelin' album. But this is a full-on country record. Dylan singing with like this country smooth kind of voice, and yeah, just kind of instill like, oh, Dylan has changed his style. Dylan never really went down the psychedelic rabbit hole. He was always true to himself. He went electric. Then he puts out albums like John Wesley Hardin and Nashville Skyline, the late '60s. So fantastic record. It's one of my favorite Dylan records. And again, a major influence on Americana artists. Stuff like To Be Alone With You, One More Night, which was done much later by Tony Rice, progressive bluegrass player. So Nashville Skyline, had to talk about it. Going back to the Byrds again, they're full-on country now with a new lineup, including Clarence White, who I mentioned, Roger McGuinn still at the helm. The Ballad of Easy Rider, you've got stuff on here like the title track, which is a gorgeous tune. Check out this version. Tom Petty does a great version of it as well. Tulsa County is a really cool song. They do a version of Jesus Is Just All Right, which a lot of people know as the Doobie Brothers song. The Byrds did it before the Doobies. Really great. Deportee is a beautiful song. Yeah, really good stuff. Again, full country. It's this rock group that's taken on kind of an alternate style of playing. And it's really, really good. The Byrds have several. Dr. Birds and Mr. Hyde, Farther Along, Bird Maniac. Some of those came in the 70s, but anyway, you get the point. And then lastly, before we jump into the 70s in another episode, you've got to talk about Mr. Townes Van Zandt. This is his self-titled record, Townes Van Zandt. Again, you would probably know him. If you don't know the name, you might know the song Poncho and Lefty, which Willie Nelson and Merle Haggard did in the 80s. Townes is just a unique and tragic voice in the world of outlaw country, singer-songwriters. Texas guy. He was hanging out with, Guy Clark, Rodney Crowell, people like that, a young Steve Earle, and they were just, picking and hanging out and learning from one another. He was never really commercially successful, but gorgeous tunes on here for the sake of the song. Waiting Around to Die is just a depressing, dark song. Colorado Girl, Lungs, I'll Be Here in the Morning, one of my favorite tunes. This is kind of, Americana is kind of kicking off. This is not your mainstream country music. This is not music that's meant to be, top 40 material. It's just good writing. It's sung from the heart. Not the best vocals. You don't need it in Americana music. Towns is the man. And if you had never heard this album, I would highly recommend checking it out. And yeah, huge influence on so many people that would, shape Americana music. So Towns Van Zandt, the self-titled. And that is going to do it for me for this episode. I hope that wasn't too boring. Let me know if you are interested in this series continuing. We'll see how this does. If not, it's just going to be a cool little standalone video. But yeah, hope you enjoyed that. Appreciate you all listening. In the meantime, y'all be good. Take care, and we'll see you on the next one. Bye now.